Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today. So this is a picture of my fireplace at home. So let us imagine that my house burns down, and then I go on to social media and I say, oh, I've lost several unfinished work. And then let's imagine that Don Rubin says it's social media. So he responds and says, Gabe, you're lying. You didn't lose any of that work. And it's social media. So I respond and say, I engage and say, well, Don, I'm going to point out that you're from Toronto and everybody knows what Torontonians are like. And you're only saying this because you're jealous. So I know this sounds far-fetched, but something similar happened 400 years ago between Ben Jonson and George Chapman. They were longtime colleagues. And so I'm going to look at their Ben Jonson's Execration Upon Vulcan. This is the poem where Ben Jonson describes him losing 7 works. I'm also going to provide an overview of accidental fires and how this has shaped the Shakespeare record. Then I'm going to look at the commentary on the 1624 feud. And then I'm going to share with you my insights on Chapman's accusation in his poem, An Invective. So Chapman is 13 years older than Ben Jonson, and their relationship goes way back to the beginning of Jonson's career. They're both well-known authors. They wrote masques, and they both subsisted on patronage and the generosity of the Jacobean ruling class. Both were well-known dramatists. Jonson's first acclaimed play, Every Man in His Humor, was inspired by Chapman's successful new comedy from the previous season called A Humorous Day's Mirth. Jonson was also influenced by the prefaces of Chapman's early poetry, and Jonson in his own right would become one of the most prolific writers of prefaces and paratexts in all literary history. So in some respects, Chapman was his mentor in the early years. They were also collaborators. They joined John Marston in writing an illicit play, Eastward Ho. This was against Westward Ho by Deaker and Webster. And their role in this illicit play landed them in prison. So they both started a letter writing campaign to get themselves out, to plead their innocence. They were also both committed classicists. In fact, Chapman is well known as the English translator of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And they also both knew that Shakespeare was a pseudonym. So in Execration, Jonson is believed to have written this in 1624, so months after his desk fire. He says that he lost 7 works. 6 of them were incomplete. So the first history of the reign of Henry V, an English grammar, a commonplace book, commentary on Horace's Ars Poetica, a foot voyage to Scotland, parcels of a play, so possibly an early version of Staple of News, and last but not least, the translation of John Barclay's Latin romance, Argenis. Now, Argenis was personally requested by King James, and this last work we know existed, probably in full, and was very likely lost in the desk fire. Now, Argenis is a historical allegory of the religious conflict in France under Henry III and Henry IV. And it also touches on more contemporary English events, such as the Overbury scandal. The tendency of Argenis is royalist and anti-aristocratic. It is told from the angle of kings who reduce the landed aristocrats' power in the interests of the country. So Execration is a 216-line mock epic poem. And if we look at the other works, not just Argenis, if we look at the other works on that list of works lost that he claims he lost, it has a very strong alignment with King James. And this is why some commentators interpret it as an address to King James, and I would agree with this interpretation. So Jonson is accounting for his productivity as the poet laureate and as a poet who's receiving a king's pension. One such example is the walk to Scotland. There's an account of it, and he's collecting a subscription as he's traveling. He's collecting money, and the scholars think that he's collecting a subscription for that. So he says that he lost it in the fire. He also, very typical of Jonson, provides literary criticism or moral lessons for his readers. He expresses judgment on encryption and romances, alchemy, news pamphlets. He argues that he could have offered to the fire that many a rein to redeem mine. In other words, his work is much more important than most other literary work in vogue. And it's okay to burn books. It's just as long as they're not Jonson's books. So this punitive nature of literary criticism, like to burn or not to burn, reminds me of the famous book burning chapter in Cervantes' Don Quixote. So I think that this is maybe some type of influence. So if we take a step back, we realize, though, that Jonson doesn't have a problem with lost manuscripts. There's over 600 literary manuscripts by Jonson from the 17th century. If we compare this with Shakespeare, there are none. So we see this as an asymmetry in the documentary record. Now, one of the explanations is like, well, how did this happen? One of the explanations is that there's accidental fires. And for a very romantic example, and this is very recent, in an article on the Literary Hub website, it's an article by Gregory Doran, the former artistic director at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And he's written this article about the Globe Fire in 1613 on Shakespeare's two heroic friends that saved the bard's plays from being burned. So I've compiled a list of accidental fires. I'm not going to go through all of them, but the number is quite sobering. There's the three fires for the theaters. This could be significant because playbooks were sometimes stored in the tiring house. And so when a theater burnt down, hypothetically, prompt books were lost. There's also the significant fire of the Master of Revels book for almost the complete Jacobean period, lost to fire, apparently. Also to Wilton House. So we're talking about letters for the Herbert brothers or Susan Vere. There's more fires. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them. There's the antiquarians there's two antiquarians who had whole stacks of plays that were lost. One of my favorites is John Warburton's Baker, used 56 play manuscripts as fire starter in the kitchen's stove, and they was unluckily burned or put under pie bottoms. And lest I forget, the Great Fire of London. I'm going to read a quote here from Paul Collins in his book, The Book of William. The Great Fire had a profound effect on the Shakespeare First Folios. It had a profound effect on all English literature, one that is still little recognized or understood today. If only names of Most plays from Shakespeare's time survive today. It may be blamed on the nights of September 2 through 5 of 1666. In the ruins of St. Paul's and the surrounding precincts, English literature was now written only in ash. The booksellers found ruin in St. Paul's vaults, and the trade's losses were absolutely staggering in modern terms. I would add to this that the authorship question was probably hugely impacted by this fire as well. So is Jonson's desk fire another one of these accidental fires? Well, according to the scholars, they think it is an accidental fire. They believe Jonson. And the commentary is made to fit. So it's marked by extreme prejudice. So the feud is framed in the context of a rivalry or artistic competition between Jonson and Chapman. And Chapman is just being jealous. Jonson was a more successful poet at this point and playwright. He also was much more financially secure compared to Chapman. And Jonson was also being recognized as a classicist. So this was like infringing apparently on Chapman's authority in that space. And another argument forwarded by the commentators is that Chapman was attacking Jonson in defense of his friend Inigo Jones, the architect and designer that Jonson reviled. I need to mention that Execration nowhere mentions Inigo Jones. So grosso modo, Chapman's poem and Invective is not read by the commentators. It's not taken seriously. I find this commentary skewed and decidedly anti-Chapman and pro-Jonson. So is this bias justified? I would argue it is not. If we look at one of Ben Jonson's friends, the Scottish writer, William Drummond, he writes this of his friend: "Of all styles, he, Ben Jonson, loved most to be named honest, and hath of that 100 letters so naming him." And the modern biographer comments, "A man who has 100 letters vouching for his honesty clearly anticipates that people are going to call him a liar or a hypocrite." So what does Chapman say? So his poem is of a similar length to Jonson's, and it's written in the exact same style. And in fact, at one point, he copies word for word from Jonson when mentioning the list of books lost, except there's one important difference. So Chapman says, yes, the desk fire happened. But he says Jonson is lying about what works were lost, except he omits the work of Argenis. And I don't think this omission is an accident, because it's at this point in the poem where Chapman is copying word for word from Jonson. He says that Jonson is Vulcan. And he says the fire was intentional. It was deliberate destruction. So I have a few burning questions. Did Jonson deliberately destroy his Argenis? Did Jonson deliberately destroy anything else? And as an address to King James, this poem circulated privately. It wasn't published in Jonson's lifetime. So why would an address to your primary patron have to circulate privately? Jonson writes in Execration, "But in my desk, what was there to a sight so ravenous and vast an appetite?" And Chapman responds, "Dame Jillian's fire his desk will fit." Who is Dame Jillian? Dame Jillian is the old woman of Brentford, a popular English folk figure who appears in comedies and poems of the 16th and 17th centuries. Brentford is a small village that lies just outside of Windsor, where, according to legend, Dame Jillian ran an inn. Jillian is most famous for leaving her friends a score of farts in her will. Literary references to Dame Jillian are overtly misogynistic, with various insinuations that she is something more than an innkeeper. She's a old procuress or brothel mistress or even a witch. Dame Jillian is often described as being an obese woman. A reader might say that Chapman is attacking Jonson's size, but he's using a mixed metaphor here. A large body's fire can fit in a small space. That makes no sense. The attack must mean something else. So we will see Dame Jillian has very specific meaning in Shakespeare. Dame Jillian is one of Falstaff's disguises in Merry Wives. Here is a picture of Ford coddling Falstaff while he is in the disguise of Dame Jillian in Act 4, Scene 2. The play Merry Wives is chock-a-block full of associations to ritualized burning. In fact, Merry Wives is an exploration of the theological concept of purification by fire. There are numerous references to purging Falstaff of his sinful ways through burning. The suspense and driving force of the plot is the looming threat that Falstaff will burn with his lust. Early in the action, Mistress Quickly will not put my finger in the fire of the tricks to be played on Falstaff. Mistress Ford says that the best way were to entertain him with the hope till the wicked fire of lust have melted him in his own grease. Merry Wives culminates with a mask-like scene called a trial fire. This is where the principal characters attempt to purge Falstaff of his sins by burning him. The trial fire is a mock purgatory scene. Mistress Quickly says, "With trial fire, touch me his finger end. If he be chaste, the flame will back descend and turn him to no pain. But if he start, it is the flesh of a corrupted heart." The characters recite variations on a theme of burning. Burn them with their tapers, or burn the night with my tabor. And another says, "Come, will this wood take fire?" And the fairies say, "Pinch him and burn him about till candles and starlight and moonshine be out." Falstaff screams from the burning ritual, "I think the devil will not have me damned, lest the oil that's in me should set hell on fire." At the end of the play, in the last word of the play, Mistress Page declares, "Let us everyone go home and laugh this sport over by a country fire." Purgatory fire is not necessarily a punishment before entering heaven, rather a purifying fire. It burns away any smaller sins we have when we die. The process of purgatory is the final purification of the elect. Merry Wives, I think, reflects a post-Reformation fascination with the old faith and its attendant mythologies. Was Chapman's reference to Dame Jillian an allusion to Shakespeare's Merry Wives? Specifically, Falstaff as an abstraction for the pseudonym Shakespeare, where the ritualized burning becomes a metaphor of anonymous publication, a form of purification that could only be realized through Ben Jonson's involvement. To my surprise, I was to discover another contemporary reference supporting Chapman's accusation, a reference that also connects with Shakespeare's First Folio in unexpected ways. This second contemporary reference is in the most infamous play of the Jacobean period, In a Game of Chess by Thomas Middleton. This was also written months after Ben Jonson's desk fire. There are two separate, deliberate scenes of burning. I'm only going to discuss one of them. It involves the character, the white fat bishop, So the White Fat Bishop is a writer who writes for the White King, King James. And he's known as a religious flip-flopper. And he used to be with the Black House. The Black House is Spanish and Catholic. The White House is Protestant and English. So the fat white bishop in the third act decides that he's going to defect back to the black side. So he's like a flip-flopper. He doesn't know which direction he's going, but he decides in the third act he's going to flip back. And to flip back, it would involve intentionally burning his books. I'll make a bonfire of my books immediately, he says. The fat white bishop is a thinly veiled depiction of Ben Jonson. For this brilliant identification of the fat white bishop, I need to credit the scholar Christopher Hale in his 2019 article, Pawn Sufficiently Holy but Unmeasurably Politic. So after reading his article, I wrote him and I said, were you aware that another contemporary was accusing Jonson of burning his books? And Hale was not. But he was very pleased to hear this because it was external textual evidence supporting already his very strong interpretation for this character. So I would suggest that this is a reference to the desk fire. Now, Game of Chess is a satiric comedy of King James's failed Spanish match, but it is also a play that is about the First Folio. Christopher Hale also made another important identification, and this is the identification to the central character in the play, the White Queen's Pawn. So the plot of the play revolves around the White Queen's Pawn. The opening variation, it's a chessboard. The opening variation is the Queen's Gambit. And this is the moving of the White Queen's Pawn to the center of the board. The plot revolves around this character. It is the most important character in the play, I think. And this would mean that the game of chess is also about the First Folio. So earlier in the play, before the fat white bishop defects, he's preparing some of his books, but there's one book in particular that he wants to present to the White King. He wants to present, and this is the stage direction in the play. It's a presentation of a book, and this is the way he describes the book he's going to present. I have writ this book out of the strength and marrow of 36 dishes at a meal. There are 36 plays in the First Folio. So I would contend that this is Ben Jonson preparing a First Folio to present to King James, or at least Middleton's spin on it. So from the very beginning of this play, in the first lines of this play, the nature of the First Folio's origins is linked with fire. So the Black Queen's Pawn shares the same column with the White Queen's Pawn. This is file D on the chessboard. It's the Queen's file. And she looks directly across at the White Queen's Pawn. And she says, so clear a masterpiece of heaven's art, wrought out of dust and ashes. So in summary, there's two of Jonson's contemporaries who commented on the desk fire. Both Chapman and Middleton accused Jonson of purposely burning books. The ideas evoked by them have strong associations with Shakespeare or the First Folio. So Jonson doesn't talk directly or explicitly, of course, about Shakespeare and execration. So if we look at what I call the argument of the poem that attempts to explain Vulcan's motivations, why Vulcan destroys art. The poem recounts the etiological story of fire and its origins. Was it because thou, Vulcan, were of old denied by Jove to have Minerva for thy bride, that since thou takest all envious care and pain to ruin any issue of the brain? So I'm going to paraphrase. Jonson argues here that Vulcan wants to destroy Minerva's progeny in an act of vengeful spite from having his love interest blocked. If we recall, Minerva's progeny are the works and creations of human ingenuity. Minerva is the sponsor of poetry and crafts. Because Vulcan was denied Minerva, Vulcan destroys works of art and culture. So throughout the poem of Execration, Jonson provides a catalog or lists of fires, comparing his desk fire with the destruction of art writ large, including the destructions of spaces of culture across London and classical history. So he mentions theaters and libraries and temples that have all burnt down from fire. However, I would suggest that this passage here can also be interpreted as Jonson alluding to Shakespeare. The phrase care and pain is uncannily familiar. Some of you here might recognize the expression. Also to issue of the brain. So envious care and pain is an almost identical phrase used in the epistle to the great variety of readers in the First Folio, an epistle that is undersigned by the platers, but that has been long attributed to Jonson. So it reads, "We pray you do not envy his friends the office of their care and pain to have collected and published them." So the force of this particular textual parallel is twofold. First, it provides further additional evidence that Jonson was the writer of this letter. But secondly, it also ties Execration to the First Folio. It likens Vulcan's activities to the editing of the Shakespeare plays. I'm not aware of anyone previously drawing attention to this parallel. I reread George Stevens's 12 pages. The 18th century editor provided 18 pages of parallels between Jonson's writing and the letter to the great variety of readers, and he doesn't mention this as a parallel. For the second example, the ruin any issue of the brain, this is not a textual parallel. This is what I would call like an ideation. And it's the reference to Minerva. And it's for me, it's a reference to the pseudonym Shakespeare. So Minerva was born from Jupiter's head, shaking a spear, an episode variously alluded to or recounted by numerous authors with obvious associations to Shakespeare. And I was reminded of Jonson's encomium, where he writes how the father's face lives in his issue. He seems to shake a lance. So in the same month of Jonson's desk fire, this is when the First Folio is nearing completion. And this is precisely the period when we would logically expect to see a massing and concentration of Shakespeare manuscripts in one place, that is on Jonson's desk. Edward Blunt and Isaac Jaggard entered 16 Shakespeare plays in their stationer's register in this same month. I also, for my research, I ordered a digital image of the entry on October 2nd, the month previously for Argenis. The reason I did this is I wanted to stress test Chapman. Was Chapman, was he really jealous and just making this up, his accusation? And because he omitted Argenis, it seemed to me to suggest that Chapman knew that this work was lost. And I wanted to make sure that the entry was not just a blocking entry. For a blocking entry, you can just put in the title. A publisher can just put in the title. They don't have to show the work to the licensing authorities. But this shows that the licensing authorities did see the work. The licensing authorities were Dr. Worrell and Master Cole Warden. And this is the exact same licensing authorities for the First Folio, as was the publisher, Edward Blunt. So if we think about the scene of preparing the First Folio for printing, there were I count at least 24 underlying manuscripts that were used for copy text. So for copy text, this is what the compositors hold to set type. And you could use a cordo, right? That would be an easier way for setting type. But in this case, we know that there was 24 underlying manuscripts that were used for copy text. But I think that this is a very conservative, low number. I would guesstimate that double the amount of manuscripts were used, because the editors were annotating and correcting using multiple sources to prepare the copy text. So this tells me that there's a massing and concentration of manuscripts at this time. Also, the editors rejected good cordos. Now, some of these are bad cordos up here, but there was clearly an editorial program or preference for manuscripts. Again, another argument that suggests for me that there's some massing and concentration of Shakespeare manuscripts. So as a part of my research, I just wanted to wrap my head around why we would deliberately destroy books. I read this book called Burning the Books, A History of the Deliberate Destruction of Knowledge by Richard Ovenden, who's the head librarian at the Bodley and at the University of Oxford. So he provides various examples of deliberate destruction. So I've summarized 3 broad categories. One of them is you cannot save everything, right? You have to let go of stuff. It's just the way it is. Then the second one, which I completely expected to read about, is conflict. And this is wars, like civil unrest and the destruction of libraries. And this is to control and manipulate narratives of the past. And then the last category was a little bit something that I hadn't expected. And it's these stories about authors, literary executors, and families destroying works. And one of the cases that Ovenden talks about is Kafka. Kafka had all of this unpublished material and manuscripts, and he left in his will to his literary executor to burn it. And his literary executor didn't follow the wishes of Kafka. He turned around and published the work. But I was surprised how many stories I just found. I didn't look long and I found too many to go over, but these stories of authors, their families and executors who intentionally destroy their work or wanted to destroy their work, but were stopped. So in addition to Kafka, I'll just rhyme off some of these: Lord Byron, Nabokov, Bulgakov, Gogol, Robert Louis Stevenson, Thomas Hardy, Charles Dickens, James Joyce, Gerard Hopkins, Richard Francis Burton, Sylvia Plath, Dora Welty, Carl Shapiro, Philip Larkin. I'm sure there's more. But then I thought, even in my own family, I think that this is a quite common story. My grandmother on my mother's side had a stack of letters that she had written with between her and my grandfather. And she burned those letters before she died. And this was against the wishes of my mom and my aunt. So Richard Ovenden has this to say: such personal decisions are made every day. But occasionally the decisions made about the fate of documents may have profound consequences for society and culture, especially when the deceased is well known in public life. Those left behind after the death of a loved one sometimes have to make decisions about the fate of personal archival material, letters and diaries especially, that have subsequently had a major impact on literary history. These decisions have often been made to save the reputation of the deceased, but also to save the reputation of those who remain. It is in this sense that these acts are actually political. That is concerned with the exercise of power, power over the public reputation and over what becomes public and what remains private. And I'm going to finish the thought for a while that was mentioned earlier. My name be buried where my body is, and live no more to shame, nor me nor you. So today, I've talked to you about Jonson's poem An Execration and his claim that he lost 7 works. I provided an overview of accidental fires and the asymmetry in the documentary record. I interrogated the underlying bias describing the Jonson and Chapman feud. My objective was to take Chapman's accusations seriously. In my research, I uncovered a second contemporary allusion to Jonson's desk fire not identified by commentators before. I also found that the publishing agents behind Argenis and the First Folio were identical. I also observed yet another parallel between Jonson's writing and the letters undersigned by the players in the First Folio. However, my conclusions are indecisive and most disconcerting. The evidence I presented here suggests that Jonson's work Argenis existed, but was lost by the desk fire of November 1623. It is possible Jonson deliberately burned his Argenis, but I don't know why he would destroy this work, a work that was personally requested by King James. I do not understand the motive. It is possible, I guess, that Jonson accidentally burned his Argenis while intentionally setting fire to other books. By other books, I mean Shakespeare's play manuscripts. On this subject, I am more bullish in my speculation. I think that Jonson intentionally destroyed Shakespeare play manuscripts at the completion of the First Folio publication and with the approval of the Herbert brothers and Susan Vere. As the general editor, Jonson was the only person who would conceivably have oversight and have possession of the total sum of manuscripts precisely at a time we would expect such amassing and concentration. For the author Shakespeare, there's a much clearer sense of motive. And I think that Jonson's dubious role in the scheme attracted the immediate suspicions and ire of colleagues George Chapman and Thomas Middleton. Their veiled accusations of 1624, if true, go a long way to explaining why there appears to have been a complete and total eradication of Shakespeare play manuscripts. Thank you.